George Crumb was born in October 1929, right as the stock market crashed, into a family of musicians. His father, George Sr., was a clarinetist and occasional drummer in the family chamber music outfit, rather grandiosely called the Crumb Family Orchestra. After moving to West Virginia to start his own life and family, he continued to play the clarinet and whatever ensemble that would take him, and arranged others' pieces. His wife, Vivian, was a cellist who would work her way up to become the principal cellist of the Charleston Symphony Orchestra. She never once missed a concert and only retired when her arthritis got too bad. George Jr. only really cared about music, and his dad got him started with clarinet lessons. The instrument that best fit his young hands was the E-flat model, effectively the piccolo of the clarinet family. The A-flat exists and is smaller but rarer. He started playing the piano soon after, and played both instruments growing up, with increasing focus on the former. He read orchestral scores at the piano and snuck them into classes to read instead of his textbooks. And as a tween, he started composing pieces in the styles of the famous European masters. He would write fake Debussy preludes, fake Brahms trios, and so on. George's younger brother was a flutist, so the family formed a second-generation family orchestra that could privately try out whatever George Jr. wrote. To Crumb, there was always a spiritual dimension to music, a connection between music and the natural world as well. He believed that each composer grew up with a natural acoustic derived from the acoustics of their formative surroundings. Crumb believed that the echoes of his native Appalachian River Valley were all over his music. The echo itself is a fundamental concept in Crumb's work, not just the phenomenon itself and sounds that lend themselves well to long reverberations, but also in the very titles of his pieces. Music is a strange substance, he wrote, with magical properties. I feel intuitively, he wrote, that music must have been the primeval cell from which language, science, and religion originated. Crumb grew up either Presbyterian or Baptist. Sources conflict. Protestant either way. As he grew older, spiritual but not religious might be a good label if we had to pick one. He was a very quiet guy who didn't like talking about his music or his creative process. He often referenced religion and spirituality in his work, even if he downplayed their significance. Crumb studied first at Charleston's Mason College, then he moved on to the University of Illinois, and by 1953 began his doctoral studies at the University of Michigan with Ross Lee Finney. He married his college sweetheart, pianist Elizabeth Brown, in 1949. He studied, and he studied, and he studied some more, but at that time, his music wasn't all that original, by his or anyone else's telling. His highly refined piano skills got him onto the faculty at the University of Colorado in 1959 to teach a class called Group Piano. He had the technical chops for sure, but he was too shy to effectively teach, and was stuck at the bottom of the music school's hierarchy. His career was at a dead end when he met David Burge, a recent hire to the piano faculty. They became fast friends and sometime competitors. In Burge's telling, Crumb's music wasn't much to look at or hear. His eventual dissertation, The Variations for Orchestra, was allegedly unplayably difficult. Among other things, it had a big percussion section and a mandolin, two early signs of his later style. It was his closest brush with 12-tone music, which he soon abandoned. His problem with the serialists is that he thought their music was all based on 3 cells. They tended towards major-minor thirds, 3-note clusters, and minor seconds a tritone apart. And I think what he's getting at here is that you have to lean into the least tonal sets if you're writing atonal music and you're afraid of bumping into something tonal. Like, yeah, there's a few thirds in here, but it's mostly minor seconds. And he does use sets like these, especially that last one, because it's got internal symmetry. And also because Bartók liked it, and Crumb really liked Bartók. Bartók was one of his guiding lights. Highly chromatic music informed by tonality, odd number symmetrical metrical patterns, and use of prime numbers, an expansive role for percussion. Crumb was baffled that no composers after Bartók contributed to the 2-piano-2 percussionist literature, so he did that later on in his music for a summer evening. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Crumb was nothing if not always thinking, and one day Burge asked his buddy to write him some piano music. Crumb said that he remembered waking up in a cold sweat one night with this realization that he'd been only rewriting others' music up until then. Nothing he'd done as a composer had ever been original. The informal Burge Commission was the thing that snapped him out of this existential rut. The result was his 5 pieces for piano, the first piece of the unmistakable George Crumb style. Audiences were attached to the surface of the music, the ways in which Crumb asked Burge to play the piano directly on the strings. Those who knew more about musical structure, like Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, were astonished at the level of craft from this then unknown composer. Crumb followed this up with Night Music 1 and 4 nocturnes, which further honed this new way of working. Night Music 1 premiered in Paris in early 1964 in a version that had free improvisation in certain sections, borrowing from the sorts of things that John Cage and Lucas Foss were doing around the same time. He didn't like the result, which led to a revised, fully composed version in 1976. Above all, the piece taught him that he didn't need a huge orchestra to get a big orchestral sound. He needed a diverse outfit with players willing to do whatever was necessary, sure, but he didn't need the orchestra, which was helpful in an era when orchestras were less and less inclined to do new music. These early pieces are all more modernist in pitch language. Seconds, tritones, sevenths, and ninths abound, as was customary in much academic music of its day. It is a dissonance-forward approach, and it meant that he had to find a way to make his music unique, that didn't have to do with pitch structures. For some composers, that was in rhythm. Others, it was form. For Crumb, it was timbre, tone color, the sound of the sound. Overnight, Crumb came from the lowest rungs of the piano faculty to success after success, and Burge, who could have easily come to resent his friend, became his first true champion, conducting those supposedly unplayable variations and premiering some of his best and most famous works, like the Pulitzer-winning ensemble piece Echoes of Time and the River. As far as I can tell, Colorado wanted to keep him, but he was a West Virginia boy at heart, losing neither his drawl nor his connection to his home. After a stint in Buffalo at the behest of Lucas Foss and his Center for Creative and Performing Arts, Crumb landed at the University of Pennsylvania, where he would stay for the rest of his career. The latter half of the 1960s saw a flurry of pieces, especially the first two books of his madrigals and the quartet 11 Echoes of Autumn 1965, the first piece that he described as 100% me. "1970 was a landmark year for Crumb for two pieces, his song cycle Ancient Voices of Children and his electric string quartet Black Angels. Black Angels, with its numerology and symmetrical structure, was a protest against the ongoing Vietnam War. That's the dark land of the piece's subtitle. It's 13 movements in 20 or so minutes, so most of these movements are short stylized bursts, similar to Webern. The simple forms of each movement are elided as one dovetails into the next. Some have heard Vietnam-era helicopters in Night of the Electric Insects, which, if we take Crumb's word for it, takes too many poetic liberties. Crumb didn't set out to write a Vietnam War piece. He said the ideas were influenced by dark vibrations from the surrounding world.
Don't hit me with them negative waves so early in the morning.
He added the subscript "in time of war" late in the process, as he became aware of what he was sensing. He didn't think much of all the 7s and 13s that pervade the structure of the piece, numbers that the quartet is asked to say in various languages. "I got carried away with the Friday the 13th thing," he said, referencing the day that he finished the piece. I think this might be some revisionist history on Crumb's part, because how would he know what day he was going to finish it up? Like, it took a long time for him to write a piece. The very next year he wrote what's probably his most famous piece, Vox Balene, or as he called it, Vox Balini, the voice of the whale. With these 3 pieces, I really think Crumb came into his own. There's a synthesis here of several different strands present in his work for a while. Extended techniques, the poetry of Lorca, theatricality, and importantly, how his pieces look on the page. So let's take some time to break each of these components down. Crumb orchestrated with extended techniques, a loaded term that I only use because it's useful, not because I like it. The argument against the term is that it's contextually ambiguous. Any weird techniques eventually become part and parcel to composers and performers, and I think there's something to the idea that calling them extended only serves to alienate them and keep them from assimilating into mainstream technique. There was a time where the Bartók pizzicato or playing sul ponticello on a string instrument was considered an extended technique. They just didn't call them that. But alas, contemporary music, YouTube is not about to change the terminology here, so I am reluctantly rolling with it. Extended techniques encompass any unusual way of playing an instrument, be it dipping a ringing piece of percussion into a bowl of water, or reaching inside the piano to strum or pluck directly on the strings. These techniques produce a whole gamut of unusual and a lot of times mesmerizing sounds. From a compositional perspective, and I still see this in some of my own students, it's hard to use extended techniques occasionally because they're so different from what we're used to hearing out of the same instruments that produce more normal sounds. If you use them just a few times in a piece, they tend to sound really out of place. And if you look at Crumb, he uses them so consistently, it is a part of his sound world. A George Crumb piano piece that is just played normally on the keys hardly sounds like a George Crumb piano piece. Of course, Crumb was not the first to reach inside the piano. Composers had been doing it off and on for some decades at that point, especially in American music. Henry Cowell was more apt to play on the strings during a performance, while John Cage's prepared piano turns the keyboard into a kind of novelty music box. The preparations are all done ahead of time, and the pianist otherwise plays normally. Cowell seems a more logical antecedent, but Cage was a contemporary of Crumb in his early 1960s crisis of confidence. Cagean techniques and terms dot Crumb's first forays into this mature style, especially Night Music 1, which indicates an absorption of Cage's writings. Some of the extended techniques of Crumb's invention, or popularization, were so distinct that they went from novel to kitschy overnight. The one that comes to mind for me is his crotales on the timpani trick. He uses this in pieces like Lux Aeterna and Music for a Summer Evening. By changing the pedal position on the kettle drum, you're able to modulate the sound of the crotale that's sitting on the head because you're changing the pitch of the resonating body that it is on. He got this completely new sound by combining standard orchestral percussion in this one particular way, and it was so personal a sound, it's like he patented it almost. Like anyone else who uses it is going to sound like Crumb in some way. This is part of a larger category of sounds where an instrument is used indirectly, as a resonating body. Crumb uses the piano as an echo chamber. He asks the pianist to keep the dampers off while other performers play into it, sympathetically vibrating the strings and leaving a quiet, ghostly sound behind. Crumb was always looking for neat sounds from the world's top performers. Another Crumb staple is the famous seagull effect from Vox Polene, a particular way of holding your hand while sliding it in artificial harmonics gives you something that sounds kinda like a bird. Crumb got it from bassist Bertram Turetsky, and the vibraphone effects in the first book of madrigals came from John Bergamo, a colleague from his stint in Buffalo. In both of these cases, it seems to me that Crumb was borrowing from musicians whose relationships to their instruments was like his relationship to the piano. I don't really quite know how to describe it, but there's a certain quality of these sounds. They're all interesting and they're kind of resonant sounds, and they work with the way that the instruments work. They're very replicable. He avoids anything that doesn't have the right resonance or ones that wouldn't be easy to duplicate from performance to performance. Crumb was inspired by world music, i.e. non-Western music, but aside from percussion, rarely calls for non-Western instruments. Percussion was easier to come by, and frankly, most percussionists will play anything that they can smack. It's easier to just give a percussionist an instrument they're not used to than somebody else. Instruments familiar to one region are also decontextualized in Crumb. The banjo has no connections to its historical roots or its typical idiom by the end of Night of the Four Moons. It's writing for folk instruments with none of the folksy imagery, and it's useful score study for composers who want to learn to write for instruments without cliches. Crumb doesn't shy away from odd doublings or asking performers to use their voices instead of, or in addition to, playing. I would argue that Crumb's fascination with unusual or exotic instruments, or one-of-a-kind combinations of instruments, is an extension of his love of extended techniques. Or rather, they're two sides of the same coin. Instruments like the musical saw or the toy piano have their contexts in American vernacular music making, but I'd bet that most American audiences have no idea what a Tibetan prayer stone sounds like. And all of these, and more, are in ancient voices of children. Any elements can coexist, Crumb said, but it was up to the composer to make the fusion of disparate elements sound intentional rather than random. Whether it's an unusual playing technique or an unfamiliar instrument, Crumb's concerns with timbre, finding the right ways of getting the sorts of echoing and ringing sounds that he loved so much. Timbre is an essential element in Crumb's music, but timbre evades traditional analysis, because traditional analysis likes structure and pitch collections and rhythms. For all his interest in color, it never extended to new pitches. He was happy with the 12 equally spaced notes from the Western tradition, and he doubted that microtones could ever be on equal footing with them. When you do see quarter tones in his music, they're part of a slippery and fast texture where pitch perception isn't really all that important. Or they're in such a high register that you can't reasonably expect a tempered pitch anyhow. His frequent collaborator, Jan de Gaetani, noted that Crumb's pitches and rhythms were never difficult in and of themselves. It was Crumb's senses of proportion, silence, and effect that really made his sound. One of my favorite timbres in Crumb is one of his simpler ones. It's God Music from Black Angels, which starts with this irregular broken chorale in crystal glasses, accompanying a really, really high cello solo. And it's moments like this where I really feel how much Crumb internalized some of the textures and timbres of electronic music, even though he never wrote any electronic music. The most Crumb asks for in that regard is for amplification. His electric piano, it's not an electric piano. It's an amplified grand piano. Amplification was a way to even out the sound and make quiet sounds more audible, preserving the timbral qualities of quiet playing, which change when playing loud. He didn't want amplification to distort the tone, as it does in the case of the electric guitar. Crumb's taste was for beautiful sounds. He didn't care if other composers rejected a sound for being too trite or sentimental, and he rarely asks for super abrasive or destructive sounds, so when they happen, and they do happen, they hit hard. I think of the scratchy pedal tones that quote the Dies Irae in the fourth movement of Black Angels. It's so intense that I play it through my nice headphones, and my cats will still squirm if they're in the same room. Black Angels also shows us how you don't need frightening timbres to make a spooky texture. The bony saraband in the final movement is one of the creepiest things I have ever heard. The pitches are heard as these tremors, just ghostly through a thimble-enhanced tremolo. It's so spine-chilling to listen to. I love it. I should point out, Crumb was far from the only composer of a century to foreground timbre. Crumb himself said that he thought Brahms was the last composer whose music could be transcribed for other instruments and ensembles without losing its defining Brahmsian character. In other words, the timbre of each line was of such importance in 20th century music that transcriptions would have to be reimaginings of the piece on some level. Timbre was also the concern of the largely European trend of spectralism, which in its purest form takes the partials of a real-life sound and attempts to realize them using acoustic means. It gets much more complicated than that. See my video on spectralism for more. Suffice to say here that spectralists saw timbre and harmony as the same thing, and post-spectral composers carry on this tradition of blurring different parameters of music together. So I don't find it all that surprising that in Zeitgeist from the late 1980s, the third movement monochord is basically a spectral piece on a low B-flat fundamental. Composers who love tone color tend to write at least one piece with this level of harmonic stasis. I mean, I wrote a 4-minute piece on one particular E last year, so, I mean, anything's possible. Like many composers, Crumb had a favorite poet, and his was Federico Garcia Lorca, whose words he set in nearly a dozen pieces, and whose imagery pervades his most compelling works. He first came across Lorca's work while doing his doctoral studies, when his friend in the cohort, Edward Chudikoff, did a Lorca setting. Lorca was a musical poet, and he had some training in music, and his gift of suggesting and evoking things, as opposed to directly saying them, has a lot in common with what music naturally is and can do. Crumb called Lorca's imagery powerful yet strangely haunting, which made it a good marriage with his music. To Crumb, Lorca cared about the basic and most essential questions of life, and the spareness of his texts left a lot of room for illumination and contextualization through music. Crumb's love of Lorca rarely meant complete settings. Rather, he found evocative lines and set them, often collating similar themes for certain pieces to give the fragmentary texts some kind of unity. This seems to have helped him write faster. Songs, Drones, and Refrains of Death, which took him a long time to write, is his most direct Lorca setting. In his cycle of madrigals, Crumb pushes and pulls individual lines, recontextualizing them and creating basically new poems out of Lorca's poetry to set. Children, death, and the cosmos are powerful, recurring images in Lorca's poetry and in Crumb's music. Some scholars have pointed out that pieces like Star Child and A Little Sweet for Christmas, 1979, have many Lorca-like themes, even though they're not Lorca settings. This connection lasted through 1970. Ancient Voices of Children was the culmination of years of working and internalizing this body of work, to the point that Crumb felt its wellspring of inspiration run dry. And he would stay away from Lorca until 1986's Federico's Little Songs for Children, where he got past his Lorca burnout by focusing on the poet's lighter side. As an aside, when I was researching, I came across the story of the first recording of Ancient Voices of Children, which was beset by scheduling conflicts. They tried to record some takes at noon, but they were recording in a hotel ballroom in Manhattan. I don't know whose idea that was. So the traffic noise that was coming in made those takes unusable. So instead of rescheduling, because they were afraid of the kid's voice changing, they decided to reconvene late at night, after the musicians were done with their other gigs, only to find that the hotel's heating system had broken down, and it was the dead of winter. So they had to share soup and cognac and one tiny little space heater to stay warm. And even then, some of them couldn't feel their toes. Reeds stuck to lips. By 7 a.m., the last notes were put on the tape. They pulled an all-nighter making this recording, and that's when the radiators clinked to life. There's one big thing that I think people can miss about Crumb's music, and this might be due to the prevalence of score follower style YouTube videos, and it's the sheer theatricality of it. Crumb wanted to put on a show, and that visual side of musical performance dovetailed with his extended techniques. And think about it, on a piano, you have a lot of opportunities for dramatically slapping and plucking and swooping right on the strings, and it can be subtle too. I'm thinking about the viol effect in Black Angels, where he asks the performers to bow on the opposite sides of their left hands, which I imagine is one of the most disorienting things you could ask of a performer. The sound is unmistakable, though, and the visual component both unusual and, I think, critical. Crumb described these effects as surrealist. I think of it more like a Brechtian detachment from the expectations of traditional chamber music performance. There's a heightened sense of ritual, solely from the musical materials. Crumb's music is not really polyphonic. Too many things happening at the same time clouds what makes each moment special. Crumb's music is best understood, I think, as a succession of certain sonic objects, with just the right space in between. It's essentially monophonic. It's his way of using music to manipulate our perception in time. Time being another one of these words that shows up a whole lot in his titles. Crumb's use of offstage instruments and effects, spatialization, is something he got from both Charles Ives and Gustav Mahler. But instead of citing those composers as influences, which they definitely were, Crumb said the spatialization was because of electronic music. Composers and listeners were now much more aware of where sound was coming from, and how that could be used in a piece. Crumb was open about the many wonderful things that the world of electronics had done for music, and yet always refused to write for electronics. It would have gone against his ideas of theatricality and eliminated all the nuances inherent in live performance. Crumb doesn't have just one stereotypical theatrical device, save for maybe asking his performers to sing or shout or whisper during performances. I'm not a huge fan of this because I think it's an effect that comes off better in pieces that are more tongue-in-cheek, but to each their own. Echoes of Time and the River has performers literally moving around on the stage. And given how classically trained performers really don't like doing that, you can see why it was a one-off. Vox Polina asks for masked players under optional blue stage lighting. Crumb added the visual elements late in the compositional process to, in his words, project a music of nature. And the ending is a diminuendo that culminates in pantomime. Crumb was invited to do the music for The Exorcist, probably due to the occult implications of Black Angels, which makes an appearance in the final score, but he turned it down. He felt the occult ties in that piece were overblown, and besides, film music wasn't his thing anyway. He was such a slow worker that even a minimally scored film like The Exorcist would take too long, and the inherent background nature of film music would rob his work of its characteristic internal drama. It wasn't just the look of his performances. Crumb's scores, all handwritten and published in facsimile of his immaculate manuscript, harkens back to the early Renaissance trend of Augenmusik, eye music, stuff that is beautiful to the eye in addition to the ear. Crumb's scores are instantly recognizable, and you don't even have to look at a single note. The complexity meant that Crumb's music, with limited exceptions, is for a solo performer, usually solo piano, or small chamber ensemble. Only 3 pieces from his mature era, Echoes of Time and the River, Star Child, and A Haunted Landscape, are for large ensemble. And unless it's for large conducted ensemble, all of his music is read from score, which in turn allows for more flexibility between players, it allows for more efficient rehearsals, and a greater ability for ensembles to act as unified hyper-instruments, which, when he wants that to happen, he can just write into the layout of the score. The designs he drew with his staves are always linked to the metaphysical content of the piece itself. Spirals and peace symbols are some of the more famous examples of this trend. In Star Child, the circular design on the first page is a string chorale that plays independent of the other lines, and it loops, hence a circle. This is one way to do it, I guess. It's hard to read from the conductor's perspective if, one of the string players is hitting a wrong note. And no, the parts don't look like this. It just forces a kind of conceptual independence. It's interesting to compare this to Charles Ives' famous piece, The Unanswered Question, which does something similar. There's multiple tempos for different layers, but Ives otherwise writes his music in a traditional, straightforward manner. If Crumb had written this, he probably would have put the string chorale in some circular design with fragments of trumpets and winds elsewhere in the score. To Ives, at least, you get a sense of proportional notation. The trumpet and strings are always in the same tempo. Crumb takes this idea and uses page layout to amplify it to dramatic extremes. Spiral Galaxy from Macrocosmos 1 was his most proud graphic notation. It was so much work, he said. In Crumb, the way that a piece looks to the performer is as much a part of the music as the resulting sound. With so many unusual effects, the performer won't always know how to shape the resulting sound. Crumb's scores are good about including a lot of adjectives and descriptions for how a movement or phrase ought to come off. I feel that all good music looks beautiful on the page, he once said. These were his musical canvases, and if he was going to do something special, like, spiralize a whole movement, he had to know that way early on in the process so the piece could end up being the right length. The music should look, Crumb said, the way it sounds. Crumb's hand-drawn scores are unique down to the smallest detail. For instance, he's one of a small group of mid-century composers who used notes instead of numbers as the denominators in their time signatures. This has some benefit when the dotted note is the beat. In other cases, I think it just kind of gets in the way. His is also the only music I know of that uses open note heads attached to beams. Usually you only see this kind of engraving in Schenkerian style reductions. And outside of Brian Ferneyhough, he's the only composer I know of who uses 128th notes so frequently that they're sometimes the beat. Because he was a pianist and he cared so much about performance detail, Crumb's scores have all the information a performer needs to execute his vision, even if the performer has never played Crumb before, even if the performer has never played contemporary music before. This helps explain the outsized popularity of pieces like the Little Suite and the Macrocosmos. They ask a lot of the performer, but you don't have to be a new music specialist to decipher the score. Crumb's four major inspirations were Chopin, Debussy, Bartók, and Ives. Piano composers have always liked writing sets and cycles. This is probably more the fault of Johann Sebastian Bach than anybody else, because his Well-Tempered Clavier books have preludes and fugues in all the keys, and that completionism became something of a model for many later composers, like Chopin and his Opus 28 preludes. Even after keys weren't as big of a deal anymore, Debussy wrote his books of preludes that cover similar breadth, even though they're not traditionally tonal. And it is in this tradition, after two of his favorite composers, who each radically reshaped the possibilities of the instrument and its literature, that Crumb wrote several books of Macrocosmos, the title a reference to Bartók's Microcosmos, and where each piece is inspired by a sign of the zodiac and dedicated to someone who was born under each sign. The initials of the Macrocosmos dedicatees were supposed to be the shout-outs to Elgar's Enigma variations, but Crumb's friends were a little too quick on the ball, and they figured out who everybody was. Like Elgar, Crumb was a retiring music obsessive. Most knew him as a quiet guy, but his closest friends got this more ebullient and talkative side. He was also, like Elgar, inclined towards explosives. There's a story of him making homemade fireworks for family Independence Day celebrations, and apparently when he was getting into doing this as a kid, he blasted his childhood neighbor's garage door clean off. Come to think of it, I remember doing that with my dad. I was about 12, we almost burned the whole neighborhood down. I think my mom's still mad about that. Sorry, Mom. Like Charles Ives, Crumb had a penchant for hymn tunes, which make up about half of his quotes, and their use is skewed towards the latter half of pieces. Ives' quotations come about the same point in his pieces. Actually, they're usually at the very, very end. The first time I heard a Crumb quote, it's probably close to 15, 16 years ago now, was in Vox Polini, which has this grotesque parody of Strauss's Also Sprach Zarathustra, better known as the opening music to 2001: A Space Odyssey. There's also in Crumb's works quotes of Bach, Schubert, medieval chant, Beethoven, the list goes on. The difference between Ives and Crumb's quotes is that Ives are about setting a nostalgic mood. Ives would have different polyphonic strands, Crumb's less inclined towards that texture. Crumb's quotes are less frequent, they're more direct, and they engage in intertextuality. For Macrocosmos, Crumb wanted to quote Rachmaninoff's Paganini variations, but due to copyright problems, he had to find similar well-known elegant D-flat major music, and he found that in Chopin, and that's what made it into the final cut. He felt a stylistic affinity, his words, with both Ives and Luciano Berio, whose best-known piece, Sinfonia, is a European take on Ivesian collage. He cited Star Child and Dream Sequence as his two most Ivesian pieces, recognizing early on that Ives was a model for how one could integrate disparate styles into a seamless whole. Mahler was another big touchstone. He was another composer concerned with memory and the preservation of tradition, and whose song cycle, Das Lied von der Erde, pervades the work of Crumb's early maturity, be it in direct musical allusion or structures. Das Lied is pretty famously back-ended with his incredibly long finale, and that's where Crumb puts his musical weight in Night of the Four Moons. Crumb retired from the University of Pennsylvania in 1997, having put in 32 years. Crumb believed that 20th century composers were at their best when young, and this included himself. By his retirement, his output, never large, became a slow drip, but there seems to have been a reinjection of joy and whimsy, maybe is a better word, around the turn of the 20th century. Crumb wrote a set of pieces based on the dogs that he'd had throughout his life. He followed it up with a set of variations on Thelonious Monk's Around Midnight. His 21st century renaissance was in his series of American songbooks, begun in 2002 and ending in 2010, dovetailing with a smaller set of Spanish songbooks composed from 2008 to 2012. The American songbooks was an undertaking Crumb compared to his Ring cycle. All keys are represented in the 4 books of the cycle, as Crumb winds his way through American vernacular music with the utmost precision. I'm inclined to make Ivesian comparisons again, it's just where my head's at. Some of the textures get a little close, but the sound world is just too different. The folk songs are not an Ivesian means to an end. They're recontextualized. What he does with the Battle Hymn of the Republic is beyond creepy. Like, he makes you feel like you're looking out at a sea of dead bodies after Antietam or something. One of the last works he composed was Chronos Kryptos, finished in 2020. George Crumb died in February 2022 at the age of 92, leaving behind a body of music that challenged and changed some of the fundamental value sets of his generation. Crumb rarely wrote about his music. For him, musical expression was where words stopped, so why try? In his few writings, he comes across as a progressively minded composer who is really wary of throwing off the past lest you throw the baby out with the bathwater. This is especially true in the world of form. No tonality means tonal forms like the sonata become these empty shells, with the remaining forms of through composition and repetition not suitable for long-term pieces. You have to find a way to keep the idea of repetition with contrast. Crumb's music uses consonance and dissonance freely, but tonal or modal elements are not used for the sake of harmonic motion. They don't really move the music along as much as texture. The relative proportion and density of texture in Crumb's music defines the long-term motion. The future, Crumb wrote, will be the child of the past and the present, even if a rebellious child. For Crumb, the advancements of technology and an increasingly global world meant that any point in time was accessible to the creative artist. Any tradition or sound from any culture and point in history could be a point of departure, but he noted that, with the end of tonality, there was no compositional unity. The promises of the electronic pioneers were for naught. And he also criticized, in 1980, reliance on rhythmic complexity to give music its momentum. His forms are not very complicated, and he never pretended that they were. He wrote by figuring out his basic materials, writing the last part of the piece first so he knew where he was going, and then spacing the materials out and slowly stringing everything together in some logical fashion, pulling longer and longer days through that process until finally notating the piece in the crisp manner that was his hallmark. His heyday in the late 1960s and early 1970s were never prolific. At best, he could do maybe 2 works a year, usually just 1. His slow pace came from his self-criticism. His primary teacher at Michigan, Ross Lee Finney, always pushed excellent handwriting and wanted each note to be the right note, even if it meant tons and tons of rewrites. Crumb internalized this. He described composition as an exercise in choosing from a pantheon of possibilities, a process that could range from a few months to 6 years in the case of songs, drones, and refrains of death. For as much as Crumb's world is that of mystery, surreality, and even hints at the occult, it was also very technical. Music might be defined, he once wrote, as a system of proportions in the service of a spiritual impulse.